Welcome to KTVB Inside the Courtroom, the Vallow-trial. Today marked day one of the jury selection, so this really is the first official day of the start of this trial that we know lots of people are going to be watching with much interest. I'm Andrea Dearden. Joining me is Alex Duggan, investigative reporter who was in the Ada County Courthouse today, not in the actual courtroom because that isn't yet allowed. Tell us about that.
Yeah, right, exactly. So we were all in this overflow room, and we could only see cameras inside the courtroom. So we were getting a feed. And the reason for that is to protect the jurors' identities, obviously. This is such a high-profile case that the jurors need to be protected, especially what they could say, what, things they could bring up in regards to jury selection. There's often, traumatic things they could bring up, things about their life. They just want to protect the process, rightfully so. And so, once the actual trial happens and the jury is sat, we will hopefully be able to be in the courtroom. But as of now, we're just getting this live feed. And they would actually cut, the cameras and the audio off for like sidebar conversations with the judge or certain questions like individual questionnaires that are mostly private between the attorneys and the jurors.
And we'll talk about that access because that's a big piece of this trial, and it's definitely going to play a role in how much we are able to know, and kind of we'll talk about what that will look like for reporters and journalists who want to be inside. And that's what we're trying to do. We want to bring you as much information about this trial as it happens, and we want to use this format to really kind of dive into some of the detail that we may not be able to share during the newscast, but really talking about, reactions and what that looked like in the courtroom. So we appreciate you being able to help us do that. Today, the questions, what were they focused on mostly? I mean, this is the first time that they're going to start eliminating jurors, a huge pool that they now have to get down to 12 jurors, and I think we're talking about 8 alternates.
We're talking about 6 alternates.
6 alternates, okay.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because the alternates are basically made for how long the trial is. So, one alternate equals 3 weeks of a trial or something like that. So you need extra alternates just for how long the trial is, which could be 8 to 10 weeks. And that's a lot to ask of a juror. And a lot of these jurors were like, I don't know if I can do that. I have kids, I have bills to pay. And, the prosecution and the defense had very, very different questions when it came to this process. So we know Lori-Vallow, she's charged with grand theft and conspiracy to commit murder and murder in the deaths of her 2 children, J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan. And she's also charged with the murder of her husband's, Chad Daybell, his ex-wife, Tammy Daybell. So there's a lot going on.
Very complicated case.
And the family tree is very, very complicated too. But the prosecution was actually so focused on this conspiracy scenario and circumstantial evidence. And so I think, based on, what the prosecution asks, you can kind of tell how they're going to move their case along and where they're trying to go.
Right.
So they gave this not crazy, but they gave this actually really simple analogy that seemed crazy to me because it explained it very well when it comes to circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
So one of the prosecutors said, hey, if your child, you tell your child, do not eat this cookie out of the cookie jar, and you leave the room and you come back and nothing seems amiss with the cookie jar, but you look at your kid and there is cookies, like crumbs and chocolate all over their face. The prosecutor, I believe it was Rachel Smith, she's assisting the prosecution. She goes, what can you infer from that basically? Can you come to a reasonable conclusion that your kid ate the cookie out of the cookie jar? And most of these jurors were like, yeah, it's my kid ate the cookie. Right. Because you can make that reasonable inference. And she goes, that's circumstantial evidence.
Because you didn't see the child eat the cookie. You weren't in the room. You have nothing to prove, as in there's no lab results, right?
Right.
And so that, like you're saying, that gives you a clue where prosecution is likely, what that evidence might look like, and what kind of evidence they're going to be hinging on in hopes of the conviction against Lori-Vallow.
Right. And another thing too, following up with that circumstantial evidence comment, the prosecution also, I don't know how many times I mentioned it, but they did say, could you, like, if an expert testified that this was murder, but they had no, like, explanation as to how the murder was committed, could you still accept that or come to a conclusion? And that is very interesting because, I mean, I don't know which victim they're referring to, but it's likely that, you know, the prosecution, these experts, these forensic scientists know this person was murdered, but they haven't figured out how. And so this is giving us like a really good kind of segue into what this case is supposed to look like. And when it comes to the defense, like, they were just kind of focused on, you know, eliminating people who had, you know, other hardships that they have to deal with. Unfortunately, there were jurors that had family members with cancer. They were excused. But this, Jim Archibald, the lori-vallow's defense attorney, all of his questions happened off camera and in private because it was about, you know, the exposure that people have gotten of this case before the trial. Okay. And he is really hammering down on that. He's said multiple times in his motions before, we know media has played a huge impact on this case. And you know, in the courtroom, like when the cameras go off, the media was told this is because, you know, these jurors, they're separated because if one juror doesn't know anything about the case and another juror says, hey, I read that Lori-Vallow is this, and this, then that juror is going to now be biased. Mm-hmm. So they have to really, really play their cards right.
Yeah, and it is a complicated process. The word for it, right, voir dire, actually means to speak the truth, and it's, you know, they use that term, a legal term, to a lot of this process, and really that is what they're trying to do, is get to the point of, do they have jurors who are able to not be so biased as to skew results that they are actually able to listen to the evidence, hear the evidence, and make a decision based on that.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, like, you have kids, like, you know, I mean, they were mentioning to these jurors, you said in your questionnaire you have kids. Could you look at an autopsy photo?
Right.
And not think of your children, which, I mean, how do you do that? You don't. And so a good point that Rob Wood, one of the Madison County prosecutors, made was it's okay to be emotional. It's okay to hate it. It's okay to be angry, but you have to be impartial. You can't say, you know, oh, well, if this was my kid, I would convict her. You have to just separate the two.
Sure.
And that was a really big part of this questioning.
Pointing out that you're human. And we're not asking you to not be human, because it would be frightening for somebody, a robot, to say, I can look at autopsy photos of children and be okay with that or not be affected. So an interesting point that, yes, we want you to be human, because in reality, that's exactly what we're asking you to do, is to make decisions as a, you know, logical, rational thinking human. At the same time, some of that emotion and some of that empathy has to probably play in well to what the prosecutors want, meaning, like, this has to matter to jurors. I mean, they are asking them to give 8 to 10 weeks of their life and to make an incredibly important decision, you know, a civic duty to sit on that juror. At the same time, interesting, because you haven't ever been there. So if someone's never been in a courtroom, never sat on a jury, never seen an autopsy photo, difficult to know how you will respond. Yeah. And I think that's, to your point about why we have so many alternates, that it is not unheard of to, at some point in a trial,
give up,
have jurors have to leave for whatever reason. And so that's obviously what they're planning for, just in case.
Exactly. And, you know, it's funny, like, the prosecution actually, so they have a certain amount of, like, options that they're allowed to say, we want this juror to be excused, right? So once again, the cookie analogy comes into play, and this juror, you know, was actually like, hey, I don't think that, you know, if I saw crumbs on my kid's face, I would assume he ate the cookie. Like, what if his sister smashed his cookie in his face, or, you know, all sorts of possibilities, right? And so the prosecution was like, well, what about this? What about this? And I think that the juror was kind of confused, or, you know, they were going back and forth, and it seemed a little bit, I guess, confusing, because this juror was you know, like, I don't know if I could actually come to a verdict based on circumstantial evidence.
Interesting.
And we know circumstantial evidence, you can use that, but it doesn't always mean that, you know, you have to have, it has to be strong.
Right.
So, and the prosecution was like, we want this juror excused. You know, Judge Boyce, he reviewed her questionnaire and he said, well, I'm not going to excuse her based on this. I'm actually going to excuse her based on questions or answers she filled out regarding media bias. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
That is interesting.
And you know, like we said, like I said in my story, they send all these questionnaires out, and then you can eliminate people, and then you bring them all in. And now we know. I was told today by a prosecutor assisting with. She's a communications director. She's assisting the prosecution. She said that their number is 42. So they're getting to 42 jurors. And once that happens, that's, you know, they're going to ask harder questions. They're going to ask different questions. They'll probably be more emotional. And they're going to narrow that scope. And then, bam, you're going to have your 12 jurors and your 6 alternates that will ultimately decide the fate of what happens to Lori-Vallow.
Wow. And a huge, huge pool to start with. And so paring that down to the 42, that's what you saw today. And like, that's the beginning of it. Interesting to see how long that takes. And then also how long the paring down of the 42 to that 18, how long that takes as well. Let's talk about access. We said this before. Access is going to be a challenge. So judges get to determine how much access, cameras, audio, that kind of access that media can have. They don't, without reason, there's certain legal reasons to be able to eliminate public from the jury, or from the courtroom, rather. That isn't the case here, but the judge in this case is limiting media access and saying no cameras in the courtroom. So what does that mean for coverage, and how is that going to create a challenge?
Well, I mean, he said no cameras, and he also said no audio as well. And, you know, we've seen multiple trials just streamed live, but unfortunately, like, this is a very big case, and I think it was a shock to everybody. But, you know, you have to just, I guess, trust the judge in his respects, because he doesn't want this stuff to taint anybody, because we know the jury isn't sequestered. They could turn on the TV and just see it. But it does create kind of, you know, a hardship, because the people that are bringing you exactly what is going on are the people in that courtroom that are just hammering it out, you know, every 30 minutes like I was today. I'm just posting updates as much as I could, because, you know, you're the eyes and ears of what's going on in there. People can't be in there if they're, you know, far away, or they're interested, they don't have the time. And there was some public in there today, just, you know, people that reserve their seats as they have a right to do. And there was a lot of media in there today. The one thing about access, though, that I thought was interesting is just cutting off the feed when they do individual questioning. And we actually spoke to somebody today that fixed that for us.
Interesting.
One of the Associated Press reporters was like, hey, you know, I just actually think that, like, you know, we should have access to this. Like, we should have access to what these potential jurors are saying about the media bias, right? Or the coverage that they've seen. Mm-hmm. And we were told, hey, you know, both these things happen in individual questioning. They question them about media bias, and they also question them about, like, horrible, traumatic things, maybe a death of a child or something like that, that could affect, you know, what their verdict might be. So those two things are very different, but they happen at the same time. And so we were wondering, hey, is it possible if you could show us how these jurors have reacted to media coverage of this case, and then turn off the cameras when they're opening up about stuff about their lives? Mm-hmm. And they actually were open to that. So now I think going on, they will open up that feed to show us how these jurors are have been exposed to the media.
Well, and it's surprising to think that they wouldn't have been, because this case has been covered, you know, whether it's online bloggers or different, you know, media, international media has covered this story. And she has somewhat of a following. There's been documentaries made, there's been multiple shows about it. And so I think it's interesting that so few jurors right off the bat said that they had a lot of exposure or felt like they couldn't be unbiased. Did that surprise you?
So what actually surprised me is I don't think there were any jurors that, well, I'll take it back. There were jurors that were excluded after the individual questioning regarding media bias. That's true. But the first panel of jurors, really nothing. Like, there were actually people who were like, yeah, I've seen some stuff, but it doesn't change anything. And then there were people who were like, I have never heard of this case. There was a woman that was like, I've lived here all my life and I haven't heard of this. And there's people like that, which, and like, it's funny because, you think there wouldn't be, but I mean, there is. I mean, some people might not be interested, but that's how it becomes helpful when you're on a jury.
And we might be a little skewed and biased because of our, the watching of it as journalists and as media folks who are very interested in what's happening. And so it may be that more people than we realize really don't have a lot of insight into this trial. This is going to be a complex, complicated case, and we've talked about we have set it out. I mean, there is a family tree. There are multiple parts and multiple players. One of the interesting parts of this is that initially, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, her most recent husband, they were supposed to be tried together. We thought initially that they were going to be on trial together. That changed. So they have separated those cases. Chad Daybell's attorney was there today. What do you make of that?
He was. John Pryor was in the overflow room today. And, I don't know what to make of it. I mean, he has every right to be there, just like every member of the public does. But also, some people were kind of confused because it's like, well, Chad Daybell's case hasn't started. So, I mean, watching this, like, are you, like, going to have a different strategy? Or, like, I mean, how, because they're alleged to be both involved in these crimes together.
Right.
So if one trial happens, how does it affect the following trial with the same crimes that they're being charged with, right? And so I think a lot of the people in the room today were very, like, confused. But then again, like, I don't know, attorney's strategy. I have no idea. And it was a little interesting, though, because he did kind of get in this little bit of, like, a tizzy with the communications person for the prosecution because he was, talking to the media a lot. But he wasn't saying anything, like, noteworthy, I guess. It was more like just comments about Lori's, like the courtroom and the just
interesting.
I don't really know. But it wasn't anything like noteworthy, but she kind of got upset because he made this comment, and then she was like, well, I actually do find it inappropriate that you are here, and I have notified the prosecution. And he said something along the lines of, well, yeah, do that or something. And so it was just a little awkward because we were all sitting there and we're like, ooh. But I don't know. Like, I guess I'm not an attorney.
Sure.
I am not. So,
but you'll be watching that, and you'll certainly let us know as the trial goes on if he continues to be there and kind of what that interaction is like. Were you able to see Lori Vallow and her reaction today? What was that like?
So the screen is so small, but it didn't really seem like, anything like crazy happened. She was very intently listening. She looked to be taking notes at one point, I think. She just seemed to be very invested in what was going on. I couldn't see exactly her face, but she was wearing glasses. She had, a black sweater on with a teal shirt underneath. Her hair was curled. Just, the typical Lori Vallow we've seen in her other hearings before.
Right.
But yeah, it just seemed like she was listening to what was going on. I mean, there wasn't really anything else that caught my attention besides that. Nothing
remarkable about her. And of course, we will said this is what the show is about. We want to bring some of that depth, some of that, the reaction, and a little bit of more kind of inside the courtroom as much as we can possibly do that. We're going to be using a sketch artist to bring as much of that visual image from the courtroom to you, those of you watching and interested in this case. What else will you be? You intend to be there every day, right?
Right, exactly. And yeah, these are some of the sketches she actually did today. And it's very, very hard. She was sketching from a screen. She wasn't allowed in the courtroom. I was sitting behind her, so it's really, really hard to sketch in great detail when you're looking from a screen. So she did a great job. But yeah, I mean, she intends to be there every day. We'll likely get sketches of what's going on every day, and I intend to be there every day. And I think that this is actually moving as quickly as it possibly can.
Right.
I'm not placing any bets, but I do feel like they will have a jury sat sometime by the end of the week, because we have Group 4 tomorrow.
Okay.
And they only need 42 people to start really hammering down on the actual jurors that will be in the trial.
Narrowing it down from there. Now, as we continue these streaming shows, we're going to be bringing you updates from the courtroom as much as that makes sense to do, and make sure that we give you the latest information. Again, that in-depth look. We're going to have our panel of journalists who are going to be part of this trial, as well as some expert guests helping us to understand, maybe providing us a little bit of insight into what the prosecution or defense might get. It's going to be really interesting to look at strategy. We'll start to be able to see a lot more of that. I think opening statements will be a really good clue, a first big clue into what kind of the strategy they're going to take and what that's going to look like. So we'll continue to do that. If you have questions that you want us to answer, you want us to look into, you can text those to us. You can let us know what you want us to be looking into for you, and we can do that. And of course, as this trial unravels and we try to piece together these parts, hopefully people will be along with us for that as we bring you inside the courtroom, the Lori-Vallow trial.